Ar-Rahman Can everyone hear me? Sister, can you hear me? Yeah, cool. All right, do we remember where we left off? Anyone remember where we left off? It was a while back. Yes, yeah. We did Kandak, and then we talked about the trial that Aisha radiallahu anha went through. So we're actually now reaching the late Medina period. We're about, I'd say about over 2/3 of the way through the Seerah. But before we start, I'll start with a bit of a description of the Prophet ﷺ. This is narrated by Omar ibn al-Khattab. He says, a man came to the Prophet ﷺ asking for something. The Prophet ﷺ replied, I do not have anything at present, but go and purchase something on my name, and I will pay for it when I have sufficient money. Omar said, O Messenger of Allah, you have already given him that which you had, and Allah did not make you responsible for that which is beyond your means. The Messenger ﷺ disliked this statement of Omar. A man from the Ansar said, O Messenger of Allah, Omar ibn al-Khattab said, from Ansar said, O Messenger of Allah, spend whatever you wish, and do not fear any diminution from the Lord of the thrones. The Messenger ﷺ smiled, and the happiness could be seen on his face due to the statement of the man. He then said, with this I have been ordered. I really like that. He's like, he didn't have anything, and he said, well, I don't have anything, so go buy something, and I'll pay for it. Yeah, and Omar said, well, you don't have to do that. That's not your responsibility. And he said, actually it is, because of this statement. So, we finished Khandak, we finished the trials of Aisha radiallahu anha, and we're in the 19th year since Prophet ﷺ received revelation. And it's shortly after Ramadan, so it's probably around the time that we're in, which is quite interesting. Shortly after Ramadan, the Prophet ﷺ has a dream. And in the dream, he leads a group of Muslims to do Umrah. So he takes this as a sign that it's time to do the first Umrah. And he tells all the Sahaba to get ready. They put on the Ihram, they take no weapons. 1,000 Muslims and about 70 camels they take with them to sacrifice. And they head towards Mecca. They're also accompanied by their wives, and famous wife of the Prophet ﷺ who accompanied, anyone know? Prophet? Salama. Salama also went with the Prophet ﷺ.
Did they have no weapons, or were they lightly armed?
Lightly armed. They had just enough as a security force, but not to go to battle or anything of that sort. And only a few of them actually had weapons. Now the Quraysh hear of this, so they sent 200 horsemen led by Khalid ibn Walid to block them, to prevent them from doing Umrah. The Muslims then divert off the normal route, and they go into a valley which is known as Hudaybiyah. Now Qaswa, who's Qaswa? Anyone know who Qaswa is?
What the meaning of Qaswa?
No, who is Qaswa? The Prophet's camel. As they reach Hudaybiyah, the Prophet's camel Qaswa sits down and will not budge. And the Prophet ﷺ tries to move him towards Mecca, but will not budge. But when they turn its head towards Medina, it gets up again, similar to the story of the elephant. Remember? So the Sahaba are complaining, and they're saying this camel's stubborn. And the Prophet says, she's not stubborn. It's not in her nature, but he holdeth her who held the elephant. So he who stopped the elephant is also now stopping the camel. Now when they get to Hudaybiyah, they realize that the wells in Hudaybiyah have all dried up. And the Prophet ﷺ makes dua, and suddenly the wells fill up with water. And they all start drinking from it. Abdullah ibn Ubay also starts drinking from the well. Everyone know who Abdullah ibn Ubay is? We've heard of him a few times, the hypocrite. He starts drinking from the water. And the Sahaba who are around him, they say, oh Abdullah, how many more miracles do you need to see to actually believe? You're literally drinking a miracle.
Well, he was praying.
He was literally drinking a miracle, and he's still not believing. And Abdullah says, I have seen miracles like this before. He just dismisses it.
But wasn't he pretending to be a Muslim?
He was, but people knew, and that's why they kept telling the Prophet ﷺ, like, everyone knows the stuff he's saying about you. Everyone knows that just because he prays and pretends, why do you not call him out? And the Prophet ﷺ didn't call him out because he actually didn't go that far out of his way to hide it either. So that's why they were saying, well, how long are you going to criticize the Prophet? You're literally drinking a miracle that he created. And he says, I've seen miracles like that before. Now, near Hudaybiyah, there was a tribe by the name of Khuza, who were allied with the Muslims. Now, they bring food to the Muslims and keep and look after them while they're in the valley. I will be very impressed, but anyone know why the tribe of Khuza is important? They're allied with the Muslims, but what's special about them?
In the future, there's going to be a big event.
Yes, that's one reason. There's another reason.
Related to the Prophet, I think.
No, we're going back in time. The Khuza tribe, before the Quraysh took over, were the ones who were in charge of Mecca. They got dispelled. So they then left Mecca and went to Hudaybiyah. This is the same Khuza tribe. Now, a leader of the Khuza tribe by the name of Budail ibn Waraka comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says the Quraysh will not let the pilgrims continue into Mecca, and warns him. The Prophet ﷺ says, can you take a message back to the Quraysh? And he says this message: we came not here for battle. We came only to make our pilgrim around the Kaaba. He that stands in our way, him we shall fight. But I will grant them time, if they so desired, to take the precautions and to leave the way clear for us. That's a big statement from the Prophet, given that they hardly have any weapons. And there's already 200 very well armed horsemen, not footmen, cavalry standing in their way. So Budail takes this message to the Quraysh. The Quraysh asks a man by the name of Hulais ibn Alqama to find out whether the truth of this. Now they're surprised. They're saying, he's saying they're going to fight us, but we've also heard they've come on pilgrimage with no weapons. What's going on? So they ask Husail to go and find out. Now, Husail was a very powerful man, not physical strength, but powerful in that he was the leader of a group known as the Ahbish. The Ahbish was a name commonly given to all the little Bedouin tribes that had allied with the Quraysh. So they weren't, so you know how we have different clans that were allied, different tribes? All the other tribes that didn't fit into that, all the miscellaneous little tribes, the Bedouin tribes, they were commonly known as the Ahbish. And Husail was the leader of the Ahbish. Now, so Husail goes and spies on the Muslims, and he returns to the Quraysh, and they say the Muslims are coming for peace. I didn't see many weapons amongst them. They're all dressed in ihram. They are coming for pilgrimage. The Quraysh then mock Husail. They say, what do you know? You're just a Bedouin. You don't know the intricacies of the city politics. This really angers him. And he puts an ultimatum down. He says, either you let them do pilgrimage, or the Ahbish will not support you anymore. We will not ally with you. This is a perfect example, and we've given other examples of how the Quraysh, the saying, give them enough rope and they'll hang themselves. This is what the Quraysh are doing. They think what they're doing is right, but every step they take, they keep putting their foot in it. And similarly, now they've lost a powerful ally. All the little Bedouin tribes that were with them are not going to support them anymore. Now, there was another person, Urwa ibn Masud, from the tribe of Taif. He was in Mecca. So the Quraysh say, can you go and find out what's going on? Are they really here to do pilgrimage? There's 700 of them. Are they going to attack us? So he goes and spies on the Muslims and comes back with this report. I have been to Khosros. Khosros is the king of Persia. To Caesar and to Negus in their kingdoms. But never have I seen a king among people like Muhammad among his companions. They will not abandon him for anything in any case. He now offers you a reasonable plan, so do what you please. So he's saying they're coming for pilgrimage. They're not going to back down. They're not going anywhere. It's quite reasonable, so do what you want, but I recommend you let them come. Now, Urwa, interesting note, after the Battle of Hunain becomes a Muslim, and with the permission of the Prophet ﷺ, he goes back to Taif to tell the people of Taif to become Muslim, and sadly, he is killed by his own people. when we do the seerah, this is something I found very interesting. We know very well about the great Sahaba, the big Abu Bakr and Uthman and Omar and all these great ones. But there's all these little Sahaba who did so much and sacrificed so much, and sometimes we forget these people. Urwa is an example of that. Now, a group of 70 young Quraysh, on their own accord, ride out to fight the Muslims. But they're captured by the little security force that the Prophet ﷺ has established. But in his mercy, he releases them all. And Surah Al-Fatah, chapter 48, verse 24, talks about this event where they were captured and then later released. So the Prophet ﷺ then decides to send Uthman to negotiate with the Quraysh. Because Uthman, from all the Sahaba, is the most prominent. He's the well protected. He knows that if Uthman sent, no one will touch him. So Uthman goes to negotiate with the Quraysh to see if there's a way that they can come to do pilgrimage. It's a stalemate now. The Muslims can't go do pilgrimage, but the Quraysh can't kick them out either. They're stuck. Now, when Uthman goes, the Quraysh tell Uthman, you know what, we like you. You're a good person, you're prominent, you're powerful. We will let you do Umrah by yourself. And Uthman says, no, I come here on behalf of the Muslims. If they don't do it, I don't do it. Then the Quraysh send a message to Abdullah ibn Ubay saying, you're a very prominent man in Medina. We have a lot of respect for you. Why don't you come and do Umrah by yourself? So what the tactic they're trying now is to turn the Muslims one against the other. Interestingly, and credit where credit is due, Abdullah also refuses despite being the hypocrite. Abdullah ibn Ubay also says no. Probably out of fear, but Allahu Alam. So the Quraysh then finally sent 3 men to negotiate with the Prophet ﷺ and to come to an agreement. Now, when they're on their way, the Prophet ﷺ also is directed to renew his pact with the Muslims there. So he asks all the Muslims there to come and give bay'ah to him and renew the pact that he has with them. We've seen the Prophet ﷺ as a father, as a soldier, as a head of state, as a prophet. This week, today, we're going to be talking about the Prophet ﷺ as a diplomat. All this today is about his diplomacy and how he managed different individuals. So he asked the Sahaba to give the pact to him, to renew their pact with him, and all the Sahaba do it except for one. Who's the one person who doesn't do it? Uthman, because he's not there. So what the Prophet ﷺ does is he takes his left hand and puts it in his right hand and gives bay'ah on behalf of Uthman. Now the Prophet ﷺ negotiates backwards and forwards with these 3 people that come from Mecca. And finally, they decide to write down the treaty. The Prophet begins dictating the terms of the treaty, starting with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Suhail, who was one of the 3 people from Mecca, interrupts him and he says, we do not know this ar-Rahman. And he demands that the document simply begin with Bismika Allahumma, in the name of God. This really aggravates the Muslims, this really upsets them. But the Prophet ﷺ says, fine. So they remove Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and put it as Suhail requested. Then the Prophet ﷺ starts to write about this is what Muhammad, the Messenger of Allah, has agreed with Suhail ibn Amr. And then again Suhail says, no, that doesn't make sense. Because if we thought that you were the Messenger of God, we wouldn't be here. We're here because we don't believe it. So the Prophet ﷺ turns to Ali and says, strike that out. Ali says, no, I can't do that. I can't bring myself to do it. And the Prophet ﷺ says, show me where it is and I will strike it. So Ali shows him and the Prophet ﷺ strikes it out himself. Finally, the treaty of Hudaybiyah is written and it's signed. And the treaty reads as this: in the name of God, this treaty which Muhammad, son of Abdullah, made with Suhail, son of Amr. They agreed to remove war from the people for 10 years. During this time, the people are to be in security and no one is to lay hands on another. Whoever of the Quraysh comes to Muhammad without permission of his protector or guardian, Muhammad is to send back to them. Whoever of those flees to Muhammad comes to Quraysh is to be sent back to him. Between us is evil to be abstained from, and there is to be no raiding or taking of spoils. Whoever wants to enter into a covenant and alliance with Muhammad is to do so, and whoever wants to enter into a covenant and alliance with the Quraysh is to do so. You are to withdraw from us this year and not enter Mecca against us, and when next year comes, you shall be able to come in front of us, and you shall enter into Mecca with your companions, and remain there 3 days. You shall have the arms of the rider's sword in scabbards, and you shall not enter in bearing anything else. So, breaking that down, what is the treaty? It is, both parties agree to a condition of 10-year truce. For 10 years, they will not fight each other. 2, any Meccan who flees to Medina must return to Mecca. Any Medinan who flees to Mecca must also return back to Mecca. There will be no tolerance of treachery or subterfuge. Each city is free to make pacts with third parties. The Muslim pilgrims will not perform the pilgrimage this year. The Muslim pilgrims may return the following year without any weapons except of that of a traveler. So this is the treaty that the Prophet ﷺ agreed to and signed on. The Prophet ﷺ also at this time renews his treaty with Banu Khuza. This is important, we'll find out why later. So he signs this alliance pact with Banu Khuza. This really upsets the Sahaba. The Sahaba are very upset about this. They're like, how could this be? You had a dream that we were going to do Umrah. We are in the truth. They're in the falsehood. Why are we backing down? Not only have you removed the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, you've then removed the name that you are the Prophet of Allah, and now we can't even do pilgrimage. And there's a lot of talk now amongst the companions about how unfair this is. Add salt to the wound, just as the treaty is signed, literally the ink has not dried, Abu Jandal escapes from the Meccans and comes to the Muslims where they are. But it's too late. The treaty is signed. The Prophet ﷺ tells Abu Jandal, you've got to go back. And he gives Abu Jandal this advice: be patient, resign yourself to the will of Allah. Allah is going to provide for you and your helpless companions relief and means of escape. We have concluded a treaty of peace with them, and we have taken the pledge in the name of Allah. We are therefore under no circumstance prepared to break it. Now Omar loses it. Omar is like, I can't take this anymore. He goes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, aren't you the true messenger of Allah? Aren't we on the path of righteousness and our enemies in the wrong? Then we shouldn't suffer any humiliation in the matter of faith. Did you not tell us that we shall perform pilgrimage? The Prophet ﷺ says, but I have never told you that we shall do it this year. Yes, I did say it, but I didn't promise you this year. Here's an issue though. Prior to this, at no point, no matter how bad the situation was, did the Muslims disobey the Prophet ﷺ. What he said they did. For the first time, there's grumbling. For the first time, Muslims are starting to say, I don't like this. I don't want to follow this. Now the Prophet ﷺ tells the Muslims, look, we need to end the rites of pilgrimage. We have to take our ihrams off. So let's cut our hair, sacrifice the animals, and we'll go back to Medina. Incredibly disappointing experience. But they don't do it. And it's a shock to the Prophet ﷺ. The Muslims, none of the Muslims obey him. He says, do it, and they won't do it. So he goes to Salama and says, what do I do? They're not listening to me. And it's a very worrying situation because they listened to him in the thick of battle. They listened to him even at Uhud. They listened to him when things were very bad. But for the first time, the Muslims are not listening to him. And Salama says, don't bother arguing with them. You do it. You cut your hair, you sacrifice your animals, and you take the ihram off. And the Prophet ﷺ does it. And when the Muslims see him doing it, they all follow and they all do it. And they go back to Medina. Surah Al-Fatah is also revealed at this time to remind the companions that what they see as a loss is not a loss. There is a hidden plan in this. And this is a really good lesson for us and for me as well. We sometimes see something and we think this is the worst that can happen. This is horrible. And not only do we see it, but everyone around us might be saying this as well. This is horrible. This is a horrible situation. But Surah Al-Fatah talks about this and says, no, what you think is horrible can turn out to be a very big win for you. And this is exactly what happened to the Muslims. Just as a side note, there was another person by the name of Abu Basir ibn Asad, who was a Muslim from Mecca. He flees to Medina, but when he comes to Medina, just like Abu Jandal, he is returned to Mecca. 2 Meccans come from Mecca to come and take him back. On their way back, when they're resting, Abu Basir gets into a tussle with the 2 of them and he kills one of them. The other one escapes and runs away. Now Abu Basir has no home. He can't go back to Mecca and he can't go back to Medina. So what does he do? He goes to the north near the coastal route and stays there. And slowly, over time, all the other Muslims who are in Mecca who can't put up with it anymore, including Abu Jandal, joins Abu Basir. And they become a renegade group, literally, it's like Robin Hood. They start attacking the caravans of the Meccans and stealing from them, and this becomes a real nuisance for the Quraysh. So what do? The Quraysh go to the Prophet ﷺ and says, do something. And the Prophet says, I can't do anything. They're not under my leadership. They're acting on their own. And so the Quraysh says, finally, okay, you know what? We'll make an exception for this group. They can come and stay with you in Medina, just as long as they stop annoying us. So Abu Basir and the group are allowed to come back to Medina. Prophet ﷺ writes a letter and sends it saying, the Quraysh have agreed, we do not have to send you guys back, come back and stay with us. Unfortunately and sadly, when the letter reads Abu Basir, he's very sick. And he reads it and he dies clutching the letter from the Prophet ﷺ. And his companions built a mosque where they had set up encampment and close to where he died, and that mosque is still there. You can still see it. It's the mosque of Abu Basir. Now, during this time, during these first 2 years, the number of Muslims grows exponentially. A lot of the clans, the other tribes start becoming Muslim. A lot of people who were not sure, who were umming and ahhing around the region, accept Islam. Because what it's showing is that in a time of peace, Islam starts to grow. The Prophet ﷺ also sends a message to Ja'far ibn Abu Talib saying that any of the Muslims who are still in Abyssinia, remember some of them came after the end of the boycott, but there were still quite a few of them in Abyssinia. And he sends a message to Ja'far saying, bring them back to Medina, because finally we have a peaceful home. Finally we're not at war. The Prophet ﷺ also marries Habiba, who is in Abyssinia at the time, and he requests the Negus ratify the marriage. So this is Sheikh Hamza Yusuf talks about how peace gave rise to the growth of Muslims. He says, the believers are quite clearly seeing that the treaty really was a great victory for them. And it's interesting because at that time, the Quraysh actually believed that it was a great victory for them too. But the opposite turns out to be true. Meanwhile, because there is a truce, there is peace. There is more interchange, the Muslims are freer, the whole environment in Mecca and Medina is a lot easier now. People are beginning to convert as a result of this event. And Allah reminds them that He can place love in the hearts after there have been enmity between the people. And this is really one of the proofs of the entire seerah of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ. You can see that the worst enemies such as Khalid ibn Walid, Ikramah ibn Abu Jahl, Amr ibn al-As, Abu Sufyan, Hind, Washi and other people going to end up becoming Muslim. This peace, this is what they needed. The constant bickering, the constant fighting, the constant war came to a stop. And that allowed the Quraysh, who had always this idea of they're the enemies, to suddenly start looking into Islam. And suddenly they're becoming Muslim. Also at this time, the Prophet ﷺ sends letters of diplomacy to the great powers that are around the region. Anyone know how many letters he sent? How many letters were sent? Anyone? In total, he sent 8 diplomatic letters. But it was 3 at this time. The others were at different times. Anyone guess where? One letter was sent to Heraclius, the emperor of Rome. Second letter? The Persian king. Third letter? Yes, the Coptic leader of Egypt. However, the remaining letters, there was also a letter sent to Negus of Abyssinia. There was a letter sent to the king of Damascus, letter to the governor of Yamama. Yamama is in kind of like central southeast of Saudi Arabia. Another one to the governor of Oman, and another to the governor of Bahrain. So, sorry?
Arab kingdom that was sort of a proxy of the Romans.
Was Ghatafan?
Sorry, it was Ghatafan, I think. It's important because that's going to cause a war.
This is the list that I've got, but when I read this, we might actually get to that. Okay. I'll see what we get. So, I'm not going to read the letters that the Prophet ﷺ said, but you can actually read the very letters. And I have a really good article that I found, so if you want to see it, I'm happy to send it, where every single letter that was sent was written down, and we still have records of it. No one of the two letters are the same. They were very personalized. It wasn't like a copy-paste for all of these, the same thing. It was a very personalized letters that the Prophet ﷺ sent to each of the leaders. So, to the Emperor Heraclius of Rome, or Byzantine, receives the letter, and this is how the story goes. The Muslim envoy, Dihya ibn Khalifa al-Khabib, was ordered to hand the letter over to the the governor of Busra, who would in turn send it to Caesar, or the king of Busra, who would in turn send it to Heraclius. Incidentally, Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, who by that time had not embraced Islam, was summoned to the court, and Heraclius asked him many questions about Muhammad and the religion which he preached. The testimony which this avowed enemy of the Prophet gave regarding the personal excellence of the Prophet's character and the good that Islam was doing and to the human race left Heraclius wonderstruck. So it's actually the testimony of Abu Sufyan that changed Heraclius' heart, even though Abu Sufyan was a sworn enemy of the Prophet ﷺ at this time. Al-Bukhari, on the authority of Ibn Abbas, narrates that Heraclius sent for Abu Sufyan and his companions, who happened to be trading in Ash-Shams, Jerusalem. This was during the truce that had been concluded between the polytheists of Quraysh and the Messenger of Allah ﷺ. Heraclius, seated amongst his chief of staff, asked, "Who amongst you is the nearest relative to the man who claims to be the Prophet?" "I," Abu Sufyan replied, "I am the nearest relative to him from among the group." So they made him sit in front and made my companions sit behind me. Then he called upon a translator and said to him, "Tell them," referring to Abu Sufyan's companions, "that I am going to ask him," referring to Abu Sufyan, "regarding the man who claims to be a prophet. So if he tells a lie, they should contradict him instantly. By Allah, had I not been afraid that my companions would consider me a liar, I would have told lies." Abu Sufyan later says. Abu Sufyan's testimony went as follows. Muhammad's descends from a noble family. No one of his families happened to assume kinship. His followers are those deemed weak, and numbers ever growing. He neither tells lies nor betrays others. We fight him, he fights us, but with alternate victory. He bids people to worship Allah alone with no associate and abandons our fathers' beliefs. He orders us to observe prayer, honesty, abstinence, and maintain strong family ties. Heraclius, on hearing this testimony, turned to his translator, bidding him to communicate to us his following impression, which reveals a full conviction in the truthfulness of Muhammad's prophethood. I fully realize that the Prophet comes from a noble family. He does not affect any previous example of prophethood. Since none of his ancestors were monarchs, we cannot then allege that he is a man trying to claim his father's monarchy. So long as he does not tell lies to people, he is for the more reason immune to telling lies as in regards to Allah. Concerning his followers being those deemed weak, with number ever growing, it is something that goes in agreement with the questions of faith until this latter assumes its full dimensions geographically and demographically. I have understood that no instance of apostasy has yet appeared amongst his followers, and this points to the bliss of faith that finds it in the abode of the human heart. Betrayal, as I see, is alien to him, because real prophets hold betrayal in abhorrence. Bidding worship of Allah with no associate, observance of prayer, honesty and abstinence, and prohibition of paganism are traits bound to subject him to all possessions. I have known that a prophet must arise, but it has never occurred to me that it will be amongst from the Arabs. If I was sure, I would be faithful to him. I might hope to meet him. If I were with him, I would wash his feet. Heraclius then requested the prophet's letter be read. The observation of the emperor, and finally the definite and clear-cut exposition of the Islamic message could not but create a tense atmosphere amongst the clergy present at the court. We were ordered to go out. Abu Sufyan said, while coming out, I said to my companions, the matter of Muhammad has become so prominent that even the king of the Romans is afraid of him. So I continued to believe that Allah's messenger would be victorious till Allah made me embrace Islam. The king did not embrace Islam, for it was differently ordained. However, the Muslim envoys were returned to Medina with greetings from the emperor. It's very interesting. If you haven't researched into Heraclius, I recommend it. He is a very, very interesting character. He actually almost single-handedly brought back the Byzantine Empire. Almost. And he's a very strong character. So he's pretty much confessing. He's saying, I would like to wash his feet. But when he's saying those words, Abu Sufyan saying, we could sense the tension amongst the clergy there. And Heraclius was really putting himself in a difficult position. Whether it was because of that or something else, Heraclius doesn't accept Islam, but he sends his greetings to the Prophet. Now, the Coptic leader or the vice-regent of Egypt responds like this. Hatam ibn Abi Balta, who was chosen to communicate the message, requested an audience with the Coptic leader, the vice-regent. Before imparting the contents of the letter, he addresses the Egypt's vice-regent by saying, there used to be someone before you who had aggregated the status of Supreme Lord, so Allah punished him and made him an example in the hereafter and in this life. Therefore, take warning, never set a bad example to others. The vice-regent answers, we are in no position to relinquish our religion except for a better one. Hatib resumes, we invite you to embrace Islam, which we will suffice you with all that you may lose. Our Prophet has called people to profess this faith. Quraysh and the Jews stood against him as bitter enemies, whereas Christians stood closest to him. Upon my life, Moses' news about Christ is identical to the latter good tidings upon the advent of Muhammad. Likewise, this invitation of ours to you to embrace Islam is similar to your invitation to the people of Torah to accept the New Testament. These people that the Prophet ﷺ said, these companions, were incredibly intelligent. He is pretty much saying, when the Christians, you Christians, invited the Jews to accept the New Testament, what we're inviting you is no different. We're inviting you now to accept Islam, which is no different to when you invited the Jews to accept the New Testament. So the vice-regent replies in a letter to the Prophet ﷺ, and he says, in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, from the vice-regent to Muhammad, son of Abdullah. Peace be upon you. I have read your letter and understood its content and what you are calling for. I already know that a coming of Prophet is still due, but I used to believe he would be born in Syria. I am sending you a present of 2 maids who come from noble Coptic family, clothing and steeds riding on. Peace be on you. So he doesn't accept Islam. He says, look, I know there's a Prophet coming, but I thought he was going to come from Syria, but I'm sending you 2 maids, 2 slave women, pretty much. I don't know if they were slaves. They were sent as gifts to the Prophet ﷺ, so possibly slaves. Anyone know one of these 2 people? Anyone know who the one of these 2 people is? Exactly. Muslim? Exactly. Maria, the Prophet ﷺ later married and had Ibrahim with. This was how Maria came to the Muslims. When the vice-regent of Egypt received the letter, he sent Maria as a gift to the Prophet ﷺ. Now, so far, all the leaders have been given more or less positive responses. The next letter goes to the king of Persia, Khosros. Abdullah ibn Huda as-Shami was chosen to carry the letter. The envoy carried it to the king of Bahrain, but we do not know as yet if the letter dispatched to Khosros by one of his men or Abdullah himself took it. We don't know. However, it reached the king of Persia. The proud monarch was enraged by the style of the letter, as the name of the Prophet had been put above his own name. That's what annoyed him. Nothing about what Islam was or what the Prophet was saying. What annoyed him was that the Prophet ﷺ wrote his name about the king of Persia's name. He tore the letter into shreds and dictated a command to his viceroy in Yemen to send a couple of troops to arrest the Prophet ﷺ and bring him to his presence. The arrogance. The governor, his name was Bazan, immediately sent 2 men to Medina for this purpose. As soon as the men reached Medina, the Prophet was given revelation and was told to tell Pervez, the emperor of Persia, has been murdered by his son. The Prophet disclosed to them the news and they were stunned by it. So these 2 people are sent to arrest the Prophet, and the Prophet says, the person who sent you has just now been killed.
My God has killed your daughter.
Yeah. And by his son, and now his son is in charge, and he says, just as your king ripped up that letter, your empire will be ripped up to shreds. This shocks them. They're shocked by it. He says, go tell your new monarch that Islam will prevail everywhere and outstrip the sovereignty of the Khosros himself. This scares the 2 people who were sent to arrest, they get scared. So they run back to Bazan and they tell him what they've heard. Just as they're telling him, a letter comes from the new monarch by the name of Seerah. And the new monarch sends a letter to Bazan saying, I have taken over. I'm in charge now. I have killed my father. I am the new king, which verifies what these people have said. And the new emperor says, stop dealing with this man. Don't arrest him. Just leave him alone. You can sense that even amongst the emperors of Persia, this is a superpower. There's fear towards the Prophet ﷺ. And Bazan, together with the Persians in Yemen, embrace Islam. The governor leaves Persia. He says, I have seen the truth. There's no way he could have known this. And him and all the Persians in Yemen become Muslim. A letter is now sent to Negus. We'll see what the response of Negus is, right? So Negus, king of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, his name was Ashama bin al-Abjar. He receives the Prophet's message. It was dispatched by Amr ibn Umayyah ad-Darmi. Now this letter is not happening at the same time. This letter was sent in the 6th year or earlier, in the 7th year. When Amr takes a letter and gives it to Negus, and Negus reads this letter, he takes it and puts it on his eyes, and then gets off his throne and prostrates on the floor, and writes a reply to the Prophet ﷺ like this: in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, from Negus, Ashama to Muhammad, the messenger of Allah, peace be upon you, O messenger of Allah, and mercy and blessings from Allah besides whom there is no God. I have received your letter in which you have mentioned about Jesus, and by the Lord of heaven and earth, Isa is not more than what you say. We fully acknowledge that with which you have been sent to us, and we have entertained your cousin, his companions, and I bear witness that you are the messenger of Allah, true and confirming those who have gone before you. And I pledge to you through your cousin and surrender myself through him to the Lord of the world. I always say, outside of the immediate Sahaba of the Prophet ﷺ, one of my favorite characters in the Seerah is Negus. He is an incredible man. I think I talked about this. Remember we talked about how when Jafar went and the conversation between Amr and Jafar, and then how the people rebelled, but Negus still stood strong. This is the difference between Heraclius and Negus. Heraclius believed, but he got scared. He backed down. Negus did not back down. He said, the truth is the truth, and if you're going to rebel against me. He even got the Muslims onto a ship to protect them. And remember the story of how he wrote Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, put it in the letter. I put it in his pocket. And we won't go back to him. But he was an incredibly brave and strong man. And I think as Muslims, all of us should have a lot of respect for Negus. Now, the king of Damascus, Abi Shamir al-Ghassani, Suja ibn Wahab had the honor of taking the letter to Harith, who, upon hearing the letter, in his audience was madly infuriated and uttered, "Who dares to dispose me of my country? I will fight him," and arrogantly rejects the Prophet's invitation to the fold of Islam. This was the king of Damascus. The letter that was sent to Huda bin Ali, governor of Yamama. The envoy who was chosen was Sulat bin Amr al-Amri, who, after communicating his message, carried back the following reply to the Prophet ﷺ. "The faith to which you invite me is very good. I'm a famous orator and a poet. The Arabs highly respect me, and I am a count among them. If you include me in your government, I am prepared to follow you." You see a wide range of responses, and this is why I'm actually reading this. Because you see the different responses. You have Negus on one end, then you have Heraclius, then you have the Copts, then you have the Persian king on the other extreme end, and then you have people like the governor of Yamama, who is like, I'm so great. I'm such a great poet. Everyone respects me. Everyone loves me. You'll be lucky to have me in your government. So you should give me a position, and then I will accept Islam. It's funny, we still have people that fit this whole range. The Prophet did not accept Hudad's demand. He usually turned down such tones and would say that the whole matter was in the hands of Allah. Later, Jibril came with revelation that Hudad had died, and the Prophet, in the context of his comment on this news, said, "Yamama is bound to give rise to a liar who will abrogate prophethood to himself, but he will subsequently be killed." And then when the question was asked who would kill the Prophet, he was said, it is a follower of Islam. Anyone know what this prophecy was about? He's saying, from Yamama will come a false prophet. And he will be killed though. Musaylama. He was referring to Musaylama. Musaylama has not even been, but the Prophet saying, Musaylama is going to come from Yamama, who the governor responded in this arrogant way. Now we have a long backwards and forwards in regards to Amr ibn al-As, who was chosen to go to the king of Oman. His name was Jafir. I don't know if I want to go through all that. The questions are pretty much around this. Who is this man? What is Islam? Why did you embrace Islam? How did you embracing Islam happen? And so Amr tells the story of his conversation with Negus. And here's the thing. Not only did Negus play a hand in letting Amr ibn al-As become Muslim, but through Amr ibn al-As, he sends the message of Islam to the king of Oman. You see how Islam spreads from one person in the smallest of actions? That one act, that bravery of Negus, then not only converts a great Sahaba, but through that great Sahaba, an entire kingdom becomes Muslim. The kingdom of Oman, the king accepts Islam, and they become Muslim. Finally, the response of Mudir ibn Sawa, governor of Bahrain. The Prophet dispatches Alal bin al-Hadrami to the governor of Bahrain, carrying a letter inviting him to embrace Islam. In reply, Al-Mundir bin Sawa wrote the letter following: Allah's messenger, I receive your injunctions. Prior to this, I read your letter which you wrote to the people of Bahrain, extending them to invitation to Islam. Islam appealed to some of them, and they entered the fold of Islam, while others did not find it appealing. In my country, there lives Magians and Jews, and therefore you may inform me to the treatment to be extended to them. This is very interesting. This one, I particularly find this one interesting. He's saying, you brought a message, I related to the people. Some became Muslim, some didn't. There are Magians and Jews still in this country. What do you want me to do with them? And the Prophet ﷺ responds like this: in the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, from Muhammad, the messenger of Allah, to Mudir bin Sawa, peace be on you. I praise Allah with no associate, and I bear witness that Muhammad is his slave and messenger. Thereafter, I remind you of Allah, the mighty, the glorious. Whoever accepts admonition does it of his own good. Whoever follows my message and acts in accordance with their guidance, he in fact accepts my advice. My messengers have highly praised your behavior. You shall continue in your present office. Give the new Muslims full chance to preach their religion. I accept your recommendation regarding the people of Bahrain, and I pardon the offenses of the offenders. Therefore, you may also forgive them. Of the people of Bahrain, whoever wants to go on their way, the Jews or the Magian faith, should be made to pay jizya. So this is very interesting. This is pretty much summing up how to deal with multiculturalism according to the Muslims. The governor of Bahrain's become Muslim. He's saying some of my people have become Muslim, but some haven't. What do I do with them? I assume there is an expectation to either exile them, kill them, but the Prophet ﷺ says no, let them be. They can pay the jizya, let them be, let the new Muslims practice Islam, let the new Muslims show these Muslims what Islam is, so that they may become Muslims. This is actually really putting into practice the word that there is no compulsion in Islam. There is this view that Islam spread by the sword. It's not spread by the sword. This is a perfect example of why Islam is not spread by the sword, where the Prophet ﷺ says, let the Muslims be themselves, and that will be evidence to the non-Muslims of how to become Muslim. And I'll stop there. I know today was a bit technical, but I think it was important because we kind of see how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with different people and different viewpoints and different responses to Islam. And hopefully we can take that on ourselves and understand how to deal with different people. Inshallah, I will see you all next Friday. Thank you for coming. Assalamu alaikum.
How's your boy? Yeah.